In today's episode, Richard Conway interviews Mike Gonski, founding chair of Story Factory and current chair of ReachOut and Carriageworks, about how to build governance structures in not-for-profit organisations without distracting from the mission.
Welcome to Minutes by Board Cycle. I'm your host, Richard Conway, and today on the podcast, I have the pleasure of interviewing Mike Gonski. Mike is the chair of ReachOut, a charity focused on mental health and wellbeing for young people, and also chairs Carriageworks, an event, performance and exhibition space here in Sydney. Mike's also a partner at law firm Herbert Smith Freehills and was the founding chair of Story Factory and NFP Creative Writing Centre for Young People. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks for having me.
So, Mike, as I just said, you've been involved with organisations like Story Factory from its founding through to now chairing ReachOut and Carriageworks in their growth periods. So I wanted to ask you, from your experience, how do you build governance structures in that NFP context that can scale as those kind of organisations grow, but without losing their focus on their mission or their soul?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And the irony that you're talking to a lawyer who thinks he's an entrepreneur always has very interesting issues in my own head as to how much governance should there be on something and how do I not stifle entrepreneurial spirit. In terms of, I guess, the luck that I had is one of the things I've always thought is if you are someone who is happy to have the self-awareness that you're definitely not the smartest person in the room, you need to get the smartest people in the room. You can mitigate risk, I think, in a very successful way. So by that, I'll give you the example is, again, age 25, I looked around and said, I can't do this. I don't have any experience. I'm a very young lawyer. What do I have access to? And so I was very lucky at that time that one of my clients was Gail Hambley, who was the Group General Counsel of Fairfax, on the Audit and Risk Committee of Fairfax. And I just asked her, I said, hey, you want to have a bit of fun and come and join a startup charity that we pay nothing and has huge amounts of risk for you. I have no idea whether it'll go well. And someone like her, I couldn't believe, said yes, would love to do that. I was extremely lucky that one of the co-founders of Story Factory was a guy called Tim Dick, who has got to be one of the best lawyers I've ever worked for or worked with. He had trained at Gilbert and Tobin. He actually was a journalist at Fairfax at the time. But his balance of understanding risk and entrepreneurialism was incredible when we started. And so we got very lucky again that I always think connectivity and relationships can be very useful in these early stage organizations. So through the fact that he'd worked at Gilbert and Tobin, they were lovely and gave us pro bono of giving us the standard policies and things that we needed to start. But equally, what was great is when at board we looked at things, we would look at the size of organization and work out what did we need. So what was interesting is as the board, I guess, grew, you would have different types of directors. So some who clearly had been on much larger boards would often in boards say things like, come on, guys, we've got to remember the difference between the board and the executive. And I think here we are acting like the executive. And I would have to, as chair, pull things back and say, well, come on, guys, like in year 1 and 2, we were running on, I think, $300,000 a year. We only had one staff member. So if Tim Dick is not putting up his hand and saying, hey, as a board director, I'm going to draft the policies, well, no one's going to do them. Our one executive that we had didn't have the ability because she wasn't trained in that way to do it. And I didn't see any risk on the difference from a governance side between board and executive if the board actually had to get their hands a little bit dirty. But I've often found, especially in the smaller organizations, I prefer a board director on my board who will err towards being more hands-on than hands-off. So, for example, I like to run our boards where we might have less board meetings, but more out-of-cycle discussions where if an issue comes up, I will make sure on my board from a matrixy perspective that we have one of every skill set we need. And I'm quite obsessed with these board matrices of skills. I love them where we go through, and this was started with this Story Factory example, was because we started with nothing, we set out a matrice of saying, oh my God, okay, well, we clearly needed someone in education. So we thought, why don't we just write literally to the Dean of Sydney Uni's Education Department and see if she'd join. And weirdly, she said yes. I've found in my career, most people, doesn't matter how senior you are, I think people are very generous with their time. And so I think in a lot of things I've been part of, we've batted well above maybe the type of director we should have got on our board for the size of organization. And then I guess by having one of everything, I like to be able to say, great, well, X person, you are the best at this. So wouldn't you mind please helping us with this? Might be the top marketing executive. We've got one at FMCG on our board of Carriageworks. And we will say, hey, the marketing execs really need some help on this thing we're doing. Any chance you can go and sit with them for an hour? I think that's a lot better than saying, I'm sorry, you can't meddle in the executive. We'll just wait for board for you to ask a question about the marketing campaign. Well, clearly they will do that too. But I think for that size of organization, we really need the help.
Yep. And so, Mike, one dynamic you sort of touched on, but I wanted to go into a bit more detail on, is that in the early stages, particularly in an NFP, the size of a board can actually be really large proportionate to the size of the organization. And so I'm guessing one of the risks there is that you can have, if you have a board of 6 people, they can all ask, each of them asks one question of the executive, and very quickly the executive team can get overwhelmed because there might be even fewer of them than there are board members. How do you protect against that kind of scenario?
Yeah, so I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I love large boards. I love boards where there may be people will say there's too many directors than you'd otherwise have thought. So I think at Story Factory we had 11. But again, back to the point is at one point we had one exec. I think when I left, maybe there were 8 or 9 exec for 11 board, but each board member was there for a particular purpose. And I think if you're a good enough chair, that is your role as to being the conductor of the orchestra, to be able to say, well, hang on a sec, why don't you guys take that on offline? It looks like you've got a particular expertise, Mr. Board Director, in this area. Perhaps you can go with the CEO and work through that issue offline and not getting bogged down in the board meeting on the particular issue.
Yep. And Mike, you talked before about NFPs, particularly small ones, needing to have hands-on directors, I guess, is the way I would describe it. Is there a point in time that you see that needs to change, that things can professionalize or the board can take more of that oversight role that we see perhaps in a corporate world? And are there particular signs for that? And then as a follow-up, how do you actually get the board, particularly if there's people on there who are really used to being hands-on, to suddenly get out of management territory and stay in board territory?
I think excellent question. I'll put it in a different way though. It's like, so as I've gone on boards that are larger, if you take Carriageworks and ReachOut, their turnover is more than 15 million a year, whereas a Story Factory back in the day would be 2 to 3 million at its max. What is interesting is I still think those organizations are still too small to say there must be only, board must only look at governance and exec must do all of the work. If you think about it, even in a reach out that might have 80, 90 staff, it still has gaps. So I'll give an example. We just put on our board Kelly Head, who is the company secretary of Sydney Airport, onto the board of Reach Out because we don't have a company secretary. And her assistance to work with our CFO has just been incredible, and so nice of her that her skill set is incredible for us to be able to help us with things like, what is our structure for our board minutes? How should they look? Are we making the board minutes too long? Do we have the right policies in place? What is the right schedule for board? I've let her run with that together with the CFO, and she's just incredible at it. So it's added so much value. Like, I am so lucky that she said yes to be on our board and that she would agree to do that assistance. We're also lucky on our Reach Out board, Ian Thorpe's on our board. And you think about it as, what a guy, like someone that does not get paid 1 cent to help Reach Out, but he agrees to be the face of a swimming event every year that raised $4 million a year. This guy he agreed this year that he would come and he will coach 20 CEOs on how to swim. so that they would raise money for ReachOut. And I'm just amazed that he would go on Sunrise and he will speak to millions of viewers about how important ReachOut is. He doesn't need to do any of that. And I don't know, I'm just so thankful that there are really good humans in this world who give their time to these types of organizations and really give their skill as well as just their governance side. And the interesting part to that is I think Ian's a good example on that, is I think he sells himself short in terms of he would probably say, I'm not trained in governance, so maybe that's not where my best skill set is. He's sat on so many boards. He's excellent. He knows exactly the right questions to ask.
Absolutely. And a last question on this topic for you, Mike. You talked before about how important you think skills matrix is for a board of an NFP, and you've talked a lot about the importance of having, say, a large board to bring specific skills, which I guess you're saying that in an NFP context, either an NFP couldn't afford to get those skills another way, or frankly wouldn't want to allocate its resources towards that particular skill, and so it's better to bring it in on the board. Does that then, I wanted to ask you about the importance of directors having lived experience around an organization's mission, because it's not always, I imagine, going to be possible to get people who are real experts in the area, the skill area that you want on the board, but who have a deep personal connection to the organization's mission. They may agree with the mission, but not necessarily have sort of the lived experience of it.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, in all the matrices, we always put it as a line item to have a discussion. So I'll give you the two examples. So clearly with ReachOut, the question is, should we have someone who's a young person who's had lived mental health experience on a board? And we look up after young people up to the age of 25. So there are people 18 to 25 who you could bring on that board. And clearly at Carriageworks, we could bring artists in or people who are involved in the arts onto our board. And to be honest, I think it'd be great if you had one out of, say, the 11 that brought that skill set. That could be excellent to be asking those questions. I think the hard thing that we had of having young people was they really are inexperienced on boards. And so I think unless you put in place excellent mentoring arrangements to let that young person feel like they've got proper access to someone. It was interesting. I quite liked it that the arts minister in New South Wales has said they're going to mandate a young person on each of, I think, the top 6 arts institution boards to get an understanding. And you know what? I think that's great. And I haven't spoken to John Graham about it, but I think if I did, I would suggest that you make sure there's good mentoring for those young people. And to be honest, I don't think it is to say to the chair, you need to take this person under your wing. Is really tricky. I would suspect if you looked at the chairs of those top 6 arts institutions, they probably have very tricky diary schedules. And if you don't have someone who has a lot of time to be able to give to mentor that person closely, I think I was really lucky that the one thing that I've always loved, and I've been 21 years at Herbert Smith Freehills, which by the way is going to be Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer as of 1 June, or probably when this podcast comes out, that the reason I am still at this firm is because of the opportunity it's given me. So when I was 25, the partner I worked for, Miles Boustick, could have easily said, I am sorry, the policy says lawyers are not able to be board directors. I think at the time there probably was that policy, but he fought for me to be allowed to do something that he could see I really wanted to do and gave me passion in life. And the thing that he did as well is he trusted me that I wouldn't let my work life down by taking on this extra thing. And so when I think about it is I always had that mentor from day one that every time I've ever been worried about something, I had an issue literally last week at Carriageworks, and I still went to him to say, hey, this is something I think you know about and you've got 20 years more experience than me. Would you mind giving me your view on how you would deal with it? And I was so lucky to have those people around me and could value that. So I think, again, if we're currently going to look for someone on our Carriageworks board, but I'd like them actually to be, I think, an arts executive. So someone who'd say been a CEO of an arts organisation, who might have ticketing experience or experience on how to work with exec in arts organisations rather than an artist themselves, because I think they will then have a skill set that will be much, much more relevant to what they do. You've got to remember as well, as a board, we can still access the people who are our stakeholders. So I really love that what we're going to do at ReachOut is, rather than have a board member that is a youth ambassador anymore, we're going to make sure that our CEO spends lots of time speaking to our youth ambassadors about what do they want, what do they need, being very transparent about our strategy so that we actually do hear from them as to, do they think what we're doing works or doesn't work? I don't think they have to sit on a board to be able to get that utility from them.